Raul Blanco was patrolling his territory when he found a waitress zip-tied and freezing to death in a snowbank, dumped like garbage to send him a warning. Instead of ignoring the body to protect his empire, the ruthless crime lord wrapped her in his cashmere coat and carried her directly into his secret safe house, breaking his own golden rule of invisibility. He didn't save her out of kindness, but to prove to his enemies that in his city, he is the only one who decides when a life ends. If this story pulled you in, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss what's coming next. I've got another unforgettable story dropping tomorrow. And while you're here, jump into the comments and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing our community from all around the world. All right, let's get back into it. The city presented two faces to those who lived within its borders. The first was the face of daylight-bright storefronts along bustling avenues, the hum of delivery trucks and taxi horns, the illusion of order maintained by painted lines and traffic signals. It was the city of office workers clutching coffee cups, of tourists photographing street art, of couples laughing outside restaurants with names they couldn't pronounce. It was a city that promised safety if you followed the rules, prosperity if you worked hard, and invisibility if you kept your head down. Then there was the second face, the one that Raul Blanco knew intimately. It was in the silence that settled after midnight, when the honest people went home, and the streets belonged to those who lived by different laws. It was in the alleys where neon signs flickered and died, where cash changed hands without receipts, where debts were paid in fear and loyalty. It was in the frozen winter nights when snow muffled screams and erased footprints, when the cold became an accomplice to violence. This was the city that didn't appear on postcards, the city of territories and hierarchies, of messages delivered through broken bones and bodies left as warnings. It was this second face that owned Raul's attention tonight. Raul Blanco was a man built for control. At 36, he stood just over 6 feet, with a lean, powerful frame that moved with deliberate precision, never rushed, never hesitant. His black hair was slicked back sharply, revealing a face of angular features and cold calculation, with dark eyes that assessed every situation for threat and opportunity. Ink crawled up his neck from beneath his collar, intricate tattoos that told stories to those who knew how to read them. He wore a long black coat dusted white with falling snow, open enough to reveal the patterned silk shirt beneath. No tie, the top buttons undone in defiance of the freezing temperature. His hands bore rings that caught the dim streetlight symbols of power, not vanity. He was a man who rarely needed to raise his voice, because people understood what silence meant when it came from him. Tonight, he shouldn't have been out here personally. He had soldiers for this man whose job was to handle disruptions, collect debts, and ensure the machinery of his empire ran smoothly. But something in his gut had told him the night wasn't clean. A missed delivery from one of his restaurant fronts, radio silence from a crew that always checked in, small things that whispered of larger problems. Raul had learned long ago. Small problems ignored became fatal mistakes. So he walked alone through the snow-covered street, breath sharp in the freezing air, footsteps muffled by fresh powder accumulating on the pavement. The city was quieter when it snowed. Sound died quickly. Evidence disappeared faster. Winter made every secret easier to bury. He was 3 blocks from the warehouse district, moving fast with purpose, when he saw her. At first, it was just a dark shape against the white, something that didn't belong in the empty street. As he closed the distance, details emerged that made his jaw tighten and his stride slow to something more deliberate. A young woman sprawled on the frozen pavement. She wore a black diner uniform, the kind with the name tag and company logo paired with a leather jacket that offered no protection against the bitter cold. Her wrists were bound behind her back with thick rope, the kind used in his warehouses. Blood had dried in a dark streak from her temple down to her jaw. Her knees were scraped raw, visible through torn black tights. A gray knit cap had fallen half off her head, revealing blonde hair matted with melting snow. She wasn't moving. Then her chest rose shallow, labored, alive. Raul stopped 10 feet away, his mind already processing what this meant. In his world, bodies left in the street were communication, warnings sent between organizations, punishments made public, boundaries enforced through violence. But the execution mattered. Clean kills commanded respect. Sloppy deaths invited chaos and questions. This was sloppy. The ropes were tied hastily, cutting into her wrists at awkward angles that spoke of panic, not professionalism. The placement was careless, dumped in the middle of a residential side street, rather than positioned deliberately where rivals would find her. No signature, no calling card, no message that made sense, which meant one of two things. Either this was a mistake, someone's personal vendetta that had nothing to do with business, or someone had acted in his territory without his permission. Both were unforgivable. Raoul approached slowly, snow crunching beneath his expensive leather shoes. As his shadow fell across her, the woman's eyes snapped open wide, glassy with shock and hypothermia, but conscious enough to register pure terror. She didn't scream. Couldn't, probably. Her lips were blue, her breathing too shallow for sound. But her eyes tracked him with animal awareness, the kind of fear that understood predators instinctively. Good. Fear kept people honest. Raoul crouched beside her, studying her face. Mid-20s, maybe. Pale skin now gray from cold exposure. Bruising around her left eye that was hours old, the edges already turning purple and yellow. A split in her bottom lip, crusted with dried blood. Someone had beaten her before binding her. Someone had taken their time. Who did this? His voice was low, controlled, carrying no warmth. She opened her mouth. Her jaw trembled violently. Only a whisper of frozen breath emerged, no words, just the rattle of someone losing the fight against cold. Raoul stood, calculating. Dead witnesses were clean, but this one might have answers. And more importantly, whoever left her here had made a critical error. They'd assumed she would freeze quietly, that her death would look accidental, that no one would ask questions about a waitress who wandered into the wrong neighborhood. They hadn't counted on him finding her first. He pulled his phone from his coat pocket. 2 calls. First to his driver, discreet pickup, back entrance, 5 minutes. Second to his medic, prepare the safe house, treat for hypothermia and trauma, no hospitals, no records, complete silence. When he ended the call, he looked down at the woman shivering violently in the snow. Her diner uniform soaked through, her skin the color of marble, her survival measured in minutes. Raoul removed his coat and draped it over her trembling form. Not kindness, strategy. In his line of work, mercy was expensive, curiosity was dangerous, but disrespect? That was unforgivable. And someone had just disrespected him in the worst possible way, by assuming they could leave a body in his territory and face no consequences. He knelt again, close enough that she could hear him through her shock. "You're going to live," he said quietly. "And then you're going to tell me everything." Her eyes widened further, not with relief, but with a different kind of terror. The kind that understood rescue might be more dangerous than death. Raoul stood as headlights appeared at the end of the street. Good. The night had just become very interesting. The safe house wasn't warm. Raoul didn't believe in comfort for complications, but it was warmer than the street. The room was concrete and shadow, lit by a single overhead bulb that cast harsh angles across sparse furniture. A metal frame bed, a wooden chair, a radiator that clanked and hissed in the corner, pushing tepid heat into the cold air. The windows were barred, not to keep people out, but to keep them in. Raoul stood against the far wall, arms crossed, watching his medic work. Dr. Kovic was in his 60s, a man who'd lost his license years ago for asking the wrong questions, and had found more profitable employment asking none at all. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking vitals, cutting away the rope binding the woman's wrists, assessing injuries with clinical detachment. "Hypothermia, stage 2, Kovic muttered, wrapping heated blankets around her shaking frame. "Another 20 minutes, and we'd be looking at organ failure. Bruising consistent with blunt force trauma to the face and ribs. Rope burns, deep. Whoever did this wasn't trained too much emotion in the binding." Raoul's eyes narrowed. Emotion. Professional restraints are efficient. These, Kovic gestured to the discarded rope now coiled on the floor. These were angry. Personal. That confirmed what Raoul already suspected. This wasn't a hit. It was rage wearing the costume of business. The woman stirred, a low moan escaping her blue-tinged lips. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then sharpening with sudden panic as she registered the unfamiliar room, the stranger hovering over her, the man watching from the shadows. She tried to sit up. Kovic pressed her back down gently but firmly. "Easy. You're still in shock." Her breathing accelerated, chest heaving beneath the blankets. Her gaze darted around the room, searching for exits, finding none. When her eyes landed on Raoul, they widened with recognition, not relief, but the kind of terror reserved for legends made flesh. She knew exactly who he was. "You're..." Her voice cracked, barely a whisper. "Alive," Raoul said flatly. "Because I decided you should be." The weight of that statement settled over her like a second set of chains. She understood immediately. Her survival was conditional, temporary, and entirely at his discretion. Kovic finished his assessment, packing his supplies with methodical care. She'll live. Keep her warm, hydrated. Watch for signs of shock returning. I'll check back in 12 hours. He left without another word, the door clicking shut behind him with a finality that made the woman flinch. Now it was just the two of them. Raoul didn't move from the wall. He'd learned long ago that stillness was its own form of pressure. It forced people to fill silence with truth. The woman pulled the blankets tighter around herself, though she was still shivering. Not from cold now, from fear. "What's your name?" Raoul's voice was conversational, almost gentle. The kind of tone that made lies feel heavier. She swallowed hard. Betty Parker. Betty Parker. He repeated it slowly, tasting the syllables for deception. "Who did this to you?" Her jaw trembled. She looked away, staring at the barred window where snow continued to fall outside, silent and relentless. "I don't know." Wrong answer. Her eyes snapped back to him, wide with desperation. "I don't. I never saw their faces. It was dark. They grabbed me from behind when I was leaving work. I couldn't." "Then tell me why." The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Raoul pushed off the wall and moved closer, not threatening, just present a reminder that nowhere in this room was safe from his attention. Betty's breathing quickened. Her fingers clutched the blanket so tightly her knuckles went white. "I worked at Rosie's diner. Night shift, midnight to 7. Her voice was barely audible. "It's nothing special. Just coffee and eggs and regulars who don't tip. And what do these regulars talk about?" Her silence was answer enough. Raoul crouched beside the bed, eye level now, close enough to see the conflict playing across her exhausted face. "In my world, Betty Parker, there are 3 kinds of people. Those who speak, those who listen, and those who disappear. Which one are you?" Tears welled in her eyes, not from pain, but from the terrible understanding that honesty might kill her just as surely as the cold almost had. "I listen," she whispered. "I'm supposed to be invisible. Refill coffee, wipe tables, not hear anything. But they talk anyway. Like I'm furniture. Who talks? Drivers, collectors, men in suits who come in at 3 a.m. and don't eat, just drink coffee and discuss." She stopped herself, fear choking off the words. "Roots," Raoul finished for her. "Numbers, names." She nodded miserably. Raoul stood, processing this. In his organization, loose lips were a terminal condition. But waitresses, janitors, delivery workers, they were background noise, invisible infrastructure. No one gave them operational details deliberately, which meant Betty Parker had simply been present. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong ears. "Did you tell anyone what you heard?" "No." The word came out desperate, fervent. "I swear. I'm not stupid. I know what happens to people who talk. I kept my head down. I kept quiet. I didn't even..." "Then why are you still breathing?" The question stopped her cold. Raoul watched understanding dawn across her face, the terrible logic of survival. "Because someone noticed anyway," she said quietly. "Not just noticed. Someone decided you were a threat. Someone bypassed proper channels, skipped authorization, and handled you personally." Raoul pulled the discarded rope from the floor, holding it up. "Recognize this?" Betty stared at the thick brown fiber, confusion flickering across her features. "Should I?" "It's from my warehouses. Tagged, tracked, accounted for." He dropped it back on the ground. "Whoever took you used my own supplies to tie you up and leave you to freeze in my territory." The implication crashed over her like cold water. This wasn't just about what she'd heard. This was about someone in Raoul's organization acting without permission. Betty's voice was barely a whisper. "What does that mean?" Raoul's expression hardened into something colder than the winter night outside. "It means someone just declared war. And you're the only witness." Betty didn't sleep that first night. How could she? Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the rope cutting into her wrists, the burn of frozen pavement against her cheek, the certainty that she was going to die alone in the snow while the city ignored her last breaths. And now she was here alive, but trapped in a room that felt more like a tomb than salvation, guarded by a man whose reputation made death seem merciful by comparison. She sat upright in the metal bed, blankets pulled to her chin, watching the door, waiting for it to open, waiting for Raoul Blanco to decide she'd outlived her usefulness. The radiator hissed and clanked, marking time and metallic rhythm. Snow continued falling outside the barred window, soft and relentless, burying the world in white silence. Dawn came slowly, gray light filtering through the storm. The door opened without warning. Betty's breath caught, her body tensing against the inevitable. But it wasn't Raoul who entered, it was a woman in her 40s, dark hair pulled back severely, carrying a tray with food and a bottle of water. She set it on the wooden chair without speaking, her movements efficient and cold. "Eat," the woman said. "Boss wants you functional." Then she was gone, the lock clicking back into place. Betty stared at the food, scrambled eggs, toast, fruit that looked too fresh for a place like this. Her stomach churned with hunger and nausea, fighting for dominance. She forced herself to eat, knowing survival required fuel, even when every bite tasted like ash. 2 hours later, Raoul returned. He entered the same way he'd left, silently, deliberately, owning every inch of space he occupied. Today he wore all black tailored slacks, fitted shirt with the sleeves rolled to his forearms, revealing more of the intricate tattoos that wrapped around his skin like armor. His dark eyes swept the room, cataloging everything, missing nothing. Betty set down the water bottle, her hands trembling despite her best efforts to appear calm. Raoul pulled the wooden chair closer to the bed and sat, resting his forearms on his knees, leaning forward with the casual confidence of someone who'd never needed to fear anything in his life. "Tell me about Rosie's diner," he said. It wasn't a request. Betty's throat tightened. "It's just a diner. 24 hours. Corner of 8th and Morrison. I've worked there for 2 years. Night shift." "Yes. Alone?" "Usually. Sometimes there's a cook in back, Tommy. Older guy. Doesn't talk much. But mostly it's just me after midnight. The owner doesn't like paying for extra staff when it's slow." Raoul's expression remained neutral, but Betty sensed the calculation happening behind those cold eyes. "Who are your regulars?" She'd known this question was coming, had spent the sleepless hours trying to decide how much truth would keep her alive and how much would get her killed. "Truckers, mostly. Guys coming off late shifts, sometimes cops, but not often they have their own places." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "And men who dress too well for a place like Rosie's. How often?" 2, 3 times a week. Always between 2 and 4 in the morning. "The same men?" Betty shook her head. "Different faces, but the same. Energy. They don't come to eat. They come to talk where no one's listening, except you were listening." "I wasn't trying to." The words came out defensive, desperate. "I was doing my job, refilling coffee, clearing plates. But they talked anyway, like I wasn't even there, like waitresses are invisible." Raoul's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. What did they talk about? This was the moment. The precipice. Betty knew that whatever she said next would determine whether she walked out of this room or disappeared into the kind of silence that swallowed people whole. She took a shaky breath. Routes, delivery schedules, numbers that didn't make sense, too big for restaurant supplies, too specific for casual conversation. And names. What names? Betty's voice dropped to a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might summon ghosts. Moretti, Kozlov, someone they called the Albanian. And, she hesitated, fear clutching her throat. And, Raoul's voice was dangerously soft. Yours. They mentioned you. Said things had to stay off Blanco's radar, that you'd cut the whole operation if you found out. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Raoul sat back slowly, his expression shifting from neutral to something far more dangerous, not anger, but cold calculation. The look of a man who'd just confirmed a suspicion and was already planning the consequences. "How long?" he asked. 3 months, maybe 4. I wasn't keeping track. I didn't think. You didn't think it mattered. Raoul finished her sentence with brutal accuracy. You thought you could hear things, file them away, stay invisible, and nothing would touch you. Betty's eyes burned with unshed tears. I didn't know what any of it meant. I don't understand your world. I just pour coffee and try to pay rent, but someone thought you understood too much. The statement landed like a physical blow. Betty pulled her knees to her chest, making herself smaller, as if she could disappear into the blankets and unmake the last 72 hours of her life. I never told anyone, she said again, voice breaking. Not my roommate, not my friends. I don't even have friends who'd care. I kept quiet because I'm not stupid. I know what happens to people who talk in this city. Raoul studied her with unreadable intensity. Then why are you still alive? Betty met his gaze, exhaustion and terror warring in her expression. You tell me. You're the one who pulled me out of the snow. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, not comfortable, but loaded with implications neither wanted to speak aloud. Finally, Raoul stood. Someone in my organization heard the same conversations you did. Someone realized you were a liability and decided to handle it quietly. Freeze to death on a side street. Case closed. Another tragic accident in a city full of them. But you found me. But I found you. He moved toward the door, then paused, looking back. Which means whoever tried to kill you now knows you're under my protection. That makes you valuable and dangerous. Betty's voice was barely audible. What happens to me now? Raul's hand rested on the door handle. That depends on whether the men who left you to die decide to finish the job. The lock clicked shut behind him. Betty pulled the blankets tighter and finally let herself cry. Raul's office was a study in controlled power. Located on the third floor of a legitimate import business, the space balanced respectability with intimidation. Dark wood furniture, leather chairs, walls lined with books that were actually read. A single window overlooking the warehouse district below his kingdom, rendered in brick and steel and shadow. But tonight, the usual order felt corrupted. Raul stood at the window, hands clasped behind his back, staring at the falling snow that continued to blanket the city. Behind him, 3 men waited in tense silence. These were his inner circle, the ones who knew where the bodies were buried because they'd helped dig the graves. "Tell me about the rope," Raul said without turning around. Leon, his logistics manager, shifted uncomfortably. Mid-40s, built like a boxer gone soft, with nervous energy that never quite settled. "It's standard inventory. We use it for securing shipments, construction, general warehouse operations. That particular type," he consulted the tablet in his hands, "comes from our supplier in batches of 50 coils. And how many are unaccounted for?" Silence stretched too long. Raul turned slowly, his dark eyes landing on Leon with the weight of a guillotine blade. "I asked you a question." Leon's throat bobbed as he swallowed. 3 coils. Missing from the Northeast warehouse inventory logged 2 weeks ago. 3 coils. Raul let the number hang in the air. "And you're just telling me this now?" It didn't seem significant. "We assumed damaged, misplaced, written off." "You assumed." Raul's voice dropped to something colder than the winter night outside. "In my organization, assumption is how people die." The other 2 men, both younger, both understanding that silence was survival, remained perfectly still. Raul moved to his desk, pulling up security footage on his laptop. "Northeast warehouse. Show me access logs for the past month." Leon's fingers trembled slightly as he navigated the system. Names and timestamps appeared on screen drivers, warehouse workers, supervisors conducting inventory checks, all routine, all authorized. Until one name appeared with disturbing frequency during late-night hours when the facility should have been nearly empty. Raul's jaw tightened. "Explain to me why Antonio Ruiz was in that warehouse 17 times between midnight and 4 a.m. in the last 3 weeks. Leon went pale. "Antonio's a senior lieutenant. He has clearance for what? Late-night rope shopping?" Raul's voice cut like a blade. "Antonio handles collections and enforcement. He has no operational reason to be in inventory warehouses at 3 in the morning. One of the younger men, Julian, sharp-eyed and ambitious, spoke carefully. "Antonio's been acting different lately, more secretive, taking calls he won't explain, disappearing for hours without checking in." Raul's attention shifted to Julian like a predator sensing weakness in the herd. "And you're just mentioning this now?" Julian met his gaze steadily, understanding that hesitation would be interpreted as complicity. "I only started noticing last week. I thought about bringing it to you, but I wanted to be sure before making accusations. Caution is wise. Silence is fatal." Raul closed the laptop with deliberate calm. "Where is Antonio now?" "Running collections in the South District," Leon answered quickly, eager to provide useful information. "He's due back by 9. Raul checked his watch. 7:15. Less than 2 hours. He moved to a locked cabinet behind his desk, removing a burner phone and a small leather journal, the kind that contained information too sensitive for digital storage. He flipped through handwritten entries, cross-referencing dates and locations. Antonio Ruiz, 32 years old, with the organization for 7 years. Worked his way up from street muscle to lieutenant through loyalty, competence, and controlled violence. Married, 2 kids, mortgage on a house he couldn't officially afford. A man who understood the system. A man who should have known better than to break it. Raul's finger stopped on an entry from 6 weeks ago. Antonio, unusual expenses. New car, jewelry. Explained as inheritance. Verify. He'd made a note to follow up and then forgotten. Small oversight. Fatal mistake. Pull Antonio's financials, Raul ordered. Everything. Bank accounts, credit cards, cash deposits, property transfers. I want to know if he's pissing away inheritance money or if someone's paying him. Leon nodded, already pulling out his phone to make calls. Raoul returned to the window, mind working through possibilities like a chess player calculating moves and counter-moves. If Antonio was running a side operation, he wasn't doing it alone. That kind of setup required infrastructure, storage, distribution, protection, buyers. It required a network, which meant the rot went deeper than one ambitious lieutenant. The diner, Raoul said suddenly. Rosie's, corner of 8th and Morrison. Pull our records. Do we use it? Julian checked his own phone, scrolling through encrypted files. It's listed as a collection point for restaurant fronts. Low-level cash drop, occasional meeting spot. Nothing significant. Who handles that route? Julian's expression shifted to something grimmer. Antonio's crew. There it was. The connection. Antonio controlled the route that included Rosie's diner. Antonio had access to warehouse inventory. Antonio had been spending money he shouldn't have. And Antonio's schedule put him in exactly the right place at exactly the right time to overhear late-night conversations about operations that were supposed to be invisible, operations that Betty Parker had also overheard. Raoul's hands curled into fists behind his back. The insult was layered not just the unauthorized operation, but the sloppiness of it, leaving a witness alive long enough to hear, deciding to eliminate her without proper cleanup, using Raoul's own supplies to do it. Antonio hadn't just betrayed the organization. He disrespected it. When Antonio arrives tonight, Raoul said quietly, bring him to the basement. Tell him I need to discuss collection quotas. Keep it casual. No alarm. Leon and Julian exchanged glances, both understanding exactly what basement meant. And the woman? Leon asked carefully. Betty Parker. What do we do with her? Raoul turned from the window, his expression carved from ice. She stays alive, under guard, no contact with anyone. If Antonio was willing to kill her once, he'll try again the moment he knows she survived. And if Antonio talks? If he tries to? Antonio won't talk. Raoul's voice carried absolute certainty. Because by the time I'm done with him, he'll understand that death is a mercy he hasn't earned. The three men nodded, filing out silently to execute their orders. Alone in his office, Raoul stared at the falling snow and thought about trust, how hard it was to build, how easy it was to break, and how expensive it was to repair. Somewhere in his empire, someone had decided they could operate without his permission. That mistake would cost them everything. Betty woke to the sound of voices outside her door, not loud, barely above whispers, but urgent in a way that made her pulse quicken. She sat up slowly, still wrapped in blankets, straining to hear through the thick metal barrier. Don't care what he said. We need protocols. Just guard her. That's the job. If Antonio finds out she's alive. The voices faded as footsteps moved down the hallway. Antonio. The name hung in the stale air like smoke. Betty didn't know who Antonio was, but she understood the tone, the way people spoke about threats they couldn't quite control. She pulled her knees to her chest, mind racing. 48 hours ago, she'd been pouring coffee and counting tips, living a life so ordinary it hurt. Now she was trapped in a concrete room, guarded by criminals, caught between men who spoke in violence and silence. The door opened without warning. Raoul entered, carrying a folder thick with papers. He wore the same black clothing as before, but something about his expression had changed, sharper, more focused, like a blade that had just been whetted. Get dressed, he said, tossing clothes onto the bed. We need to talk. Betty stared at the pile. Dark jeans, a plain sweater, clothes that looked new and exactly her size. How did you... 10 minutes. He turned toward the door. Wait. The word came out before she could stop it. Raoul paused, not turning around. Betty's voice trembled. What's happening? I heard people talking about someone named Antonio. Is he the one who... Get dressed, Raoul repeated, his tone allowing no argument. Then you'll understand everything. He left, the lock clicking behind him. Betty changed quickly, her hands shaking as she pulled on the unfamiliar clothes. They fit perfectly, which somehow made everything worse. It meant Raoul's people had assessed her size, procured clothing, anticipated her needs with the efficiency of an organization that disappeared problems. She was either being protected or prepared for burial. When the door opened again, Raoul wasn't alone. The woman from breakfast stood behind him, arms crossed, watching Betty with the same cold assessment as before. This is Elena, Raoul said. She'll be staying with you. It wasn't a comfort. It was a warning. Raoul gestured for Betty to follow him. They moved through narrow corridors lit by harsh fluorescent bulbs, past closed doors that suggested other rooms, other secrets. The building felt larger than she'd imagined, a maze designed to disorient, to make escape impossible. They stopped at a door marked only with a number, 7. Inside was a small room with a table, 2 chairs, and a laptop. Raoul gestured for Betty to sit, then opened the folder he'd been carrying. He spread photographs across the table like a dealer revealing cards. Crime scene photos. Betty's stomach lurched. The images showed the street where she'd been, left her body sprawled in the snow, captured from multiple angles. Someone had taken pictures before Raoul arrived. Someone had documented her near death with clinical precision. "These were taken by my security team," Raoul said, his tone neutral. "Standard protocol for anything unusual in our territory." Betty couldn't look away from the photos. Seeing herself like that, broken, abandoned, dying, made the horror real in a way memory hadn't. She looked so small in the images, so insignificant against the vast white emptiness of the winter street. "Why are you showing me this?" Her voice was barely a whisper. Raoul pulled out another photograph. "Because you need to understand what was supposed to happen." This image showed a close-up of the rope binding her wrists. Raoul pointed to specific details, the rough fiber, the hasty knots, the angle of the restraints. "These knots weren't professional," he explained. "They were angry, personal. Whoever tied you wasn't following orders, they were improvising." He pulled out a different photo, this one showing tire tracks in the snow near where she'd been found. "You weren't dumped from a moving vehicle. You were walked to that location, forced to kneel, then left." Raoul's finger traced the evidence in the snow. "See these marks? That's where you struggled, where your knees hit the pavement before you fell forward." Betty's breath came faster, panic rising in her chest as the memories crashed back, hands shoving her down, the brutal cold of concrete against her skin, the certainty that she would die there. "Stop," she whispered. "Please." Raoul didn't stop. He pulled up weather data on the laptop. The temperature that night was 18 degrees. With wind chill, it felt like 6. The snow was falling at approximately 1 inch per hour. He turned the screen toward her, showing a medical chart. Hypothermia progresses in stages. At 18 degrees, without proper clothing, unconsciousness occurs in approximately 90 minutes. Death follows within 3 hours. He paused, letting the numbers sink in. "You were left there at 11:43 p.m. I found you at 1:17 a.m. Betty's mind did the math automatically. 94 minutes. She'd been minutes away from unconsciousness, an hour away from death. "Why?" The word came out broken. "Why are you telling me this?" Raoul closed the laptop with deliberate calm. "Because you need to understand this wasn't a quick execution. This wasn't a bullet or a blade designed to end you efficiently." His dark eyes locked onto hers with uncomfortable intensity. This was meant to look like an accident. A waitress who left work, got disoriented in the snow, wandered into the wrong neighborhood, and froze. The implications crashed over Betty like ice water. No body, no crime, no investigation. Exactly. You would have disappeared quietly. Another statistic in a city that stops caring after the first snowfall. Betty's hands trembled on the table. "But someone would have noticed I was missing. My roommate, my boss, would have assumed you quit, ran off, got into trouble on your own." Raoul's voice carried brutal honesty. "You're 24 years old, working a dead-end job, living paycheck to paycheck. In this city, people like you vanish every day. Nobody looks too hard." The truth of it hurt worse than the cold had. "Antonio Ruiz," Raoul continued, "chose that method deliberately. Slow, quiet, clean. No evidence of foul play, just unfortunate circumstances. Antonio Ruiz," Betty repeated the name, tasting it like poison. He's the one who decided you were a problem." Raoul gathered the photographs back into the folder. "And he's the one who's about to learn that killing without permission carries consequences." Betty looked up at him, fear and confusion warring in her expression. "What are you going to do?" Raoul stood, straightening his shirt with casual precision. "What I should have done weeks ago, cut out the rot before it spreads. And me? What happens to me?" For the first time, something almost like sympathy flickered across Raoul's face. Almost. "You stay alive, Betty Parker. Because the moment Antonio learns you survived, he'll come to finish what he started." Antonio Ruiz arrived at 9:15, exactly as scheduled. Raoul watched from the security monitors as Antonio's black SUV pulled into the warehouse loading bay, tires crunching over salted pavement. The lieutenant stepped out average height, stocky build, wearing an expensive leather jacket that was too nice for collection work. His movements were relaxed, confident, the posture of a man who believed he was untouchable. That confidence would be gone within the hour. Leon met Antonio at the door, their exchange caught on silent video. A handshake, casual conversation, Leon gesturing toward the elevator with the ease of routine. Nothing to suggest tonight was different from any other check-in. Raoul switched cameras, tracking their progress through the building. Elevator descending, hallway empty, the basement door opening. Antonio stepped into the concrete room and stopped. The space was bare except for a single chair bolted to the floor, a table with tools arranged with surgical precision, and overhead lights that cast harsh shadows across every surface. This room had one purpose, and everyone in the organization knew what it was. Antonio's confidence fractured. He turned back toward the door and found it already closed, Leon standing guard outside. Raoul entered from a side door, hands in his pockets, expression neutral. "Antonio," he said conversationally, "thank you for coming." Antonio's throat worked. "Boss, Leon said you wanted to discuss quotas." I lied. Raoul moved to the table, running his fingers across the arranged tools, pliers, knives, a hammer, rope. "Well," Leon lied, "on my instruction." The color drained from Antonio's face. "I don't understand." "Don't insult me." Raoul's voice remained calm, which somehow made it more terrifying. "We both know exactly why you're here." Antonio's hands curled into fists, his body tensing with the instinct to run or fight. But there was nowhere to run, and fighting Raul Blanco was suicide. 3 coils of rope, Raul continued, missing from the northeast warehouse. 17 unauthorized visits between midnight and 4 a.m. over 3 weeks. Unexplained income totaling $47,000 in the past 2 months. He picked up a photograph from the table Betty sprawled in the snow. "And 1 waitress left to freeze in my territory without my permission." Antonio's eyes went wide, genuine shock registering across his features. Not shock at being caught, shock that Betty was evidence instead of a buried secret. "She's dead," Antonio said too quickly. "I checked the reports. No body recovered. Assumed wrong." Raoul set the photograph down carefully. "I found her. 94 minutes after you left her. Still breathing." The implications crashed over Antonio like a collapsing building. His breathing accelerated, sweat beading on his forehead despite the basement cold. "Boss, I can explain." "Then explain." Raoul leaned against the table, arms crossed, giving Antonio the floor. "Explain why you're running an unauthorized operation through my restaurant fronts. Explain why you're moving product I don't know about, using routes I didn't approve, and eliminating witnesses without clearance." Antonio's mouth opened and closed, calculations racing behind his eyes. How much to admit, how much to deny, whether truth or lies would save him. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he finally said. "The operation, it started small. Side money, clean routes, nothing that would interfere with official business. Side money." Raoul's tone remained dangerously neutral. "In my organization, there is no side money. There's money that flows through proper channels, and there's theft. It wasn't theft. I was going to bring it to you once it was established, once I could prove it was profitable. You were going to present me with a finished operation and expect gratitude?" Raoul's voice dropped to something colder. "You think I built this empire by letting people operate behind my back and then rewarding them for it?" Antonio's desperation became palpable. "I had investors, people who wanted in on the action but didn't want official connections. I thought I could expand our reach, bring in new revenue streams." "Who?" The single word cut like a blade. Antonio hesitated, and that hesitation told Raoul everything. "You're protecting them." Raoul pushed off the table, moving closer. "These investors who wanted unofficial access to my territory. You're more afraid of them than you are of me. They're businessmen, legitimate people who— Give me names, Antonio." "I can't. They'll kill me if—" Raoul's hand shot out, gripping Antonio's throat with sudden, brutal efficiency. Not choking, just holding a reminder of how quickly control could shift. "You think they'll kill you?" Raoul's voice was barely a whisper. "You think whatever they'll do is worse than what happens to people who betray me?" Antonio gasped, hands instinctively grabbing Raoul's wrist. "Kozlov, the Albanian, Moretti's nephew. They approached me 6 months ago with a proposal." Raoul released him. Stepping back, Antonio staggered, sucking in air, hand pressed to his throat. Those names changed everything. Kozlov ran trafficking through the eastern ports. The Albanian controlled gambling and extortion in the warehouse district. Moretti's nephew was a trust fund gangster trying to build reputation through his uncle's connections. They weren't investors. They were rivals testing boundaries, using Antonio as a wedge to crack Raoul's organization from the inside. The waitress, Raoul said. Betty Parker. Why her? Antonio's shoulders slumped in defeat. She heard too much. Late nights at Rosie's, we used it as a meeting spot because it was neutral, quiet. We didn't think the staff mattered. But she was always there, always listening. And one night Kozlov said something specific about routes and she reacted. Just a flinch, but enough. So you decided to eliminate her. I panicked. Antonio's voice cracked. Kozlov said she was a liability, that if she talked to anyone, if she talked to you, the whole operation would collapse. He wanted her gone immediately, professionally. But I thought... He stopped, realizing how damning his next words would be. You thought freezing her would be cleaner, Raoul finished. No bullets, no blood, no questions. Just an accident that would disappear under the snow. Antonio nodded miserably. Raoul walked a slow circle around him, predator assessing prey. You made 4 mistakes, Antonio. First, operating without permission. Second, using my resources to do it. Third, killing in my territory without authorization. And fourth, he stopped directly in front of Antonio, eyes cold as winter, failing to confirm the kill. Boss, please. Betty Parker is alive, which means she can testify, which means everyone now knows you're not just a thief, you're incompetent. Antonio dropped to his knees. I'll fix it. I'll find her, finish it properly. You'll do nothing. Raoul's voice carried absolute finality. Because the moment Kozlov and his partners learn she survived, they'll send their own people to clean up your mess. And that, Antonio, is about to become very useful. Antonio looked up, confusion and terror mixing in his expression. Raoul smiled sharp, cold, promising violence. You're going to help me set a trap. Betty heard the screaming start at midnight. It came from somewhere below her room, muffled by concrete and distance, but unmistakable. Not words, just raw sound. Pain vocalized, terror made audible. She pressed her hands over her ears, curling into herself on the metal bed. But nothing could block out the knowledge of what was happening in the basement. Someone was paying for her survival. Elena sat by the door, arms crossed, expression unchanged. She'd been present for hours, silent guardian or warden. Betty couldn't tell which. When Betty looked at her with wide, pleading eyes, Elena simply shook her head. Don't ask questions you don't want answered. The screaming stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse. In the basement, Raoul stood over Antonio's broken form, with the detached calm of a surgeon finishing an operation. The lieutenant was still conscious barely. Blood dripped from split knuckles where Raoul had methodically shattered the bones with the hammer. Antonio's face was a mess of bruises and cuts, his breathing ragged and wet-sounding, but his eyes were still focused, still aware. That was intentional. Pain was a message, but consciousness was the delivery system. I want you to understand something, Raoul said, his voice conversational despite the violence. This isn't punishment for stealing. Theft I can forgive, it's expected, even. Ambition is natural. He crouched beside Antonio, meeting his glazed eyes. This is punishment for disrespect. For thinking you could operate in my territory, use my resources, and kill on my streets without consequence. For believing you were smarter than the system I built. Antonio tried to speak, but only blood-flecked whispers emerged. Raoul stood, gesturing to Leon and Julian, who'd watched the entire interrogation in grim silence. Get him cleaned up. Medical attention enough to keep him functional. I need him alive for what comes next. They moved forward with practiced efficiency, dragging Antonio toward the service elevator. Raoul removed his rings one by one, setting them on the table beside the tools. His knuckles were bruised but not broken. He'd learned long ago how to inflict maximum damage while maintaining his own capability. He washed his hands in the industrial sink, watching pink water spiral down the drain. The physical act of violence never bothered him. It was necessary, mechanical, a language spoken fluently in his world. What bothered him was the waste. Antonio had been competent, loyal for years, and had thrown it all away for money and ego. Trust, once broken, could never be fully repaired. His phone buzzed. A text from one of his surveillance teams. Package confirmed. Kozlov's people mobilizing. ETA 2 hours, right on schedule. Raoul had released information through carefully controlled channels, whispers that Betty Parker was alive, protected, ready to talk. He'd made sure Antonio's partners heard exactly what they needed to hear. That their operation was compromised, that a witness could destroy everything, and that Raul Blanco's attention was focused elsewhere, leaving gaps in his security. The trap was set. Now he just needed them to walk into it. Upstairs, Betty jumped when the door opened. Raul entered, looking exactly as he had hours before, composed, clean, showing no signs of whatever had happened in the basement. Only his knuckles, slightly swollen and bruised, hinted at violence. Betty pressed herself against the wall, instinctively trying to create distance. "You heard," Raoul said. "Not a question." She nodded mutely. "Good. You should understand what it costs to keep you alive." He moved to the window, looking out at the snow that continued falling in the darkness. "Antonio Ruiz will survive. He'll recover. But he'll never work in this city again, and everyone in my organization will know exactly why." Betty's voice was barely audible. "What did he tell you?" "Everything." Raoul turned to face her. "The operation he was running, the partners financing it, and the fact that you were never the real target, you were collateral, leverage to keep a secret that was already rotting from the inside." "I don't understand." "Antonio was being used. Rival organizations wanted access to my territory, my roots, my infrastructure. They found an ambitious lieutenant willing to play the middle, convinced him he could get rich and get away with it." Raoul's expression hardened. "You heard conversations you weren't supposed to hear. You became a liability. And rather than handle it properly, report it. Let me decide Antonio tried to solve the problem himself." Betty absorbed this, the full weight of it settling on her shoulders. "So I almost died because I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. You almost died because powerful men wanted to test my control, and you were convenient." Raoul moved closer, his presence filling the small room. "But here's what you need to understand. They know you're alive now. I made sure of it, which means they're coming to finish what Antonio started." Terror flooded Betty's system. "What? Why would you?" "Because chaos is an opportunity." Raoul's voice carried cold calculation. "Antonio's partners think I'm distracted, that my organization is fractured by betrayal. They think they can send a team to eliminate you, clean up their mess, and retreat before I respond. They're wrong." Betty's breathing accelerated. "You're using me as bait." "I'm using you as a solution," Raoul corrected. "When they come for you, they'll walk into a trap that eliminates them and sends a message to every other organization in this city. My territory is not negotiable, and if something goes wrong, if they actually... nothing will go wrong." The certainty in his voice was absolute. "I have 30 men positioned around this building. I have surveillance on every approach. I know exactly who's coming, how many, and what they're armed with. They'll be dead before they reach the second floor." Betty stared at him, caught between horror and a twisted sense of security. This man had beaten someone unconscious in her name. He'd dismantled part of his own organization to protect her, not out of kindness, but because she represented something larger: control, respect, order. She was a symbol wearing a diner uniform. "What happens after?" she asked quietly. "After you've sent your message and killed whoever comes, what happens to me?" Raoul studied her with unreadable eyes. "That depends on whether you can live with what you've seen, whether you can keep the kind of silence that protects both of us. And if I can't," the question hung between them, heavy with implication. Raoul moved toward the door. "Then you'll discover that I'm very good at solving problems permanently." He left before she could respond, the lock clicking with finality. Betty sat alone in the darkness, listening to footsteps in the hallway, guards taking position, weapons being checked, the mechanical preparation for violence. She thought about the screaming from the basement. She thought about Antonio Ruiz, broken but alive, a warning made flesh. And she understood with crystalline clarity that her survival depended on becoming exactly what Raoul needed: a witness who would never speak. Outside, snow continued falling, burying the world in white silence. The attack came at 3:17 a.m., exactly when Raoul predicted. Betty heard it begin not with gunfire, but with silence. The ambient sounds of the building suddenly stopped. No footsteps in hallways, no distant conversations. Just hollow quiet that pressed against her eardrums like water pressure. Elena stood abruptly, hand moving to the weapon holstered at her hip. She pressed a finger to her lips, then moved to the door with practiced efficiency, listening. Betty's heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to ask what was happening, but fear locked the words in her throat. Then the first gunshot cracked through the silence. The sound was sharp, immediate, followed by a cascade of others, pop, 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 overlapping in violent rhythm. Shouting erupted, male voices barking commands and warnings. Glass shattered somewhere below. Heavy footsteps pounded through corridors. Elena drew her weapon, positioning herself between Betty and the door. "Stay down. Don't move. Don't make a sound." Betty slid off the bed, pressing herself into the corner farthest from the door, making herself as small as possible. Her whole body trembled, adrenaline flooding her system with the primal urge to run despite having nowhere to go. More gunfire. Closer now. The staccato rhythm of automatic weapons mixed with single shots, deliberate and controlled. Men were dying in the hallways. She could hear it in the screams cut short, the heavy thuds of bodies hitting concrete. The lights went out. Darkness swallowed the room completely, broken only by the faint glow of emergency lighting seeping under the door. Betty's breathing sounded impossibly loud in her own ears. Elena moved toward the window, keeping low, weapon raised. She was barely visible, just a shadow among shadows, positioned to see without being seen. "How many?" Betty whispered, unable to stay silent. "Quiet." Elena's voice was steel. The gunfire intensified, then began to fade, not stopping, but moving. The fight was traveling through the building like a storm, controlled chaos, orchestrated by someone who understood exactly how violence flowed. Raoul. 3 floors down, Raoul moved through the warehouse with lethal precision. He'd positioned his men in overlapping kill zones, using the building's architecture as a weapon. Narrow corridors that funneled attackers, blind corners where ambush was inevitable, stairwells that became death traps. Kozlov's team had come prepared, 8 men, professionally armed, moving with military discipline. But they'd walked into a space designed specifically to neutralize superior firepower through strategic positioning. Raoul caught movement in his peripheral vision, a figure clearing a corner too aggressively. He fired twice, center mass, the suppressed weapon producing wet coughs instead of cracks. The man dropped without ceremony. Leon's voice crackled in Raoul's earpiece. "East stairwell secured. 3 down." Julian followed seconds later. "South corridor clear. 2 neutralized." Raoul advanced toward the service elevator where 2 attackers had taken cover, laying suppressive fire toward his men's positions. They were well trained, communicating through hand signals, conserving ammunition, but they'd made a critical error. They'd entered his territory thinking surprise was advantage enough. Raoul circled behind them using maintenance passages only his people knew existed. He emerged from a storage room 15 feet behind their position, weapon raised. They never heard him coming. 2 shots. 2 bodies. "Main floor secured," Raoul said into his mic. "Sweep for stragglers." He moved toward the upper levels, taking stairs 3 at a time, checking corners with practiced efficiency. The building had gone mostly silent again, just sporadic gunfire as his men finished clearing rooms. When he reached the 3rd floor, he found Julian standing over a wounded attacker, weapon trained on the man's head. The attacker was young, maybe 30, bleeding from a shoulder wound but conscious and defiant. He glared up at Julian with the kind of hatred that transcended pain. "Who sent you?" Julian demanded. The man spat blood. "Go to hell." Raoul approached, footsteps echoing in the corridor. The wounded man's eyes tracked him, recognition and fear flickering across his features. "Kozlov or the Albanian?" Raoul asked conversationally. Silence. Raoul crouched beside him, studying the tactical gear, the weapons, the earpiece still transmitting dead static. "Doesn't matter. You're already a corpse. The only question is whether you die quickly or slowly." The man's jaw tightened, but his resolve was cracking. Pain had a way of reshaping priorities. "Kozlov," he finally gasped. "Contract hit. 50,000 for the girl. Clean execution. No witnesses. And if you failed?" The man's expression twisted with grim understanding. "We weren't coming back anyway." Raoul stood. "Then you got what you came for." He nodded to Julian, who fired once. The sound echoed briefly, then faded into silence. Betty heard footsteps approaching, measured, deliberate, not frantic. Elena tensed, weapon raised toward the door. 3 knocks, a pause, 2 more knocks. Elena relaxed fractionally, moving to unlock the door. Raoul entered, his black clothing torn in places, a streak of blood across his jaw that clearly wasn't his. He looked like violence made human-controlled, efficient, utterly without remorse. His eyes found Betty immediately. "You're unharmed." It wasn't a question, but she nodded anyway. "It's over," Raoul said. 8 confirmed dead. No survivors. No loose ends. Betty's voice shook. Who were they? Kozlov's people. Professionals sent to finish what Antonio started. Raoul moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered streets where emergency lights would never arrive. They won't send more. How do you know? Because I'm about to make sure Kozlov understands the cost of operating in my territory without permission. Raoul's expression was carved from ice. Before morning, he'll receive very specific packages. So will the Albanian. So will Moretti's nephew. They'll understand that testing my boundaries comes with consequences they can't afford. Betty absorbed this, understanding exactly what packages meant. Parts of the men who'd come to kill her, delivered as warnings to the men who'd sent them. She should have been horrified, should have recoiled from the brutality, the casual discussion of dismemberment and terror. Instead, she felt something darker, relief mixed with gratitude twisted into guilt. These men had come to kill her. Raoul had stopped them. The methods didn't matter when the alternative was her body freezing in snow. What happens now? She asked quietly. Raoul turned from the window, studying her with unreadable intensity. Now we finish this. Finish what? Making sure no one ever questions my control again. His voice carried absolute certainty. And deciding what to do with the woman who survived long enough to see it all. The weight of those words settled over Betty like a shroud. She'd witnessed murder, torture, organized violence on a scale that made her complicit simply by breathing the same air. She could never testify, could never speak, could never go back to the life she'd known. That person, Betty Parker, waitress at Rosie's diner, invisible and ordinary, had frozen to death in the snow. Whoever she was now existed only at Raoul Blanco's discretion. Outside, dawn began breaking through the storm clouds, pale light touching snow-covered streets where bodies would never be found and questions would never be asked. The safe house felt different after the violence. Betty sat in the small room where she'd been held for 5 days, but the bars on the windows no longer seemed like imprisonment, they felt like protection. The concrete walls weren't a tomb, they were a barrier between her and a world that had tried to erase her. She stared at her hands, turning them over slowly. They looked the same as they had a week ago. Same small calluses from carrying hot plates. Same chipped nail polish she hadn't bothered to fix. But they felt foreign now, like they belonged to someone else. The door opened. Raoul entered alone. No guards, no weapons visible. He wore different clothes, charcoal slacks, a black button-down with the sleeves rolled to his forearms, revealing the intricate tattoos that wrapped around his skin like stories written in ink. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, his expression tired in a way she hadn't seen before. He looked almost human. Almost. He pulled the wooden chair close to the bed and sat, leaning forward with his forearms on his knees, hands clasped loosely. For a long moment, he just studied her, not with the cold assessment of earlier days, but with something closer to curiosity. "You haven't asked to leave," he finally said. Betty's throat tightened. "Would it matter if I did?" "Yes." The answer surprised her. "You're not a prisoner anymore, Betty Parker. You haven't been since the moment I pulled you out of the snow. Then what am I?" Raoul considered the question carefully. "A complication. An investment. A loose end that refuses to be tied off cleanly." He paused. "A survivor." The last word hung between them, weighted with meaning neither wanted to examine too closely. "I need to understand something," Betty said quietly. "Why did you save me?" "The real reason. Not the explanation about territory or disrespect or control. The actual reason." Raoul's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Does it matter?" "It matters to me." Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but heavy with unspoken truths fighting to stay buried. "I've built an empire on rules," Raoul finally said. "Structure. Hierarchy. Everyone understands their place, their boundaries, their consequences. It works because it's predictable. Violence has purpose. Death has meaning. Nothing happens without reason." He looked toward the barred window, where morning light filtered through falling snow. "When I found you in that street, bound and bleeding and left to freeze, it represented everything I've spent 15 years preventing: chaos, unnecessary cruelty, waste." His voice dropped lower. "In my world, people die for betrayal, for disrespect, for breaking rules everyone agreed to follow. They don't die because they happen to overhear a conversation while pouring coffee." Betty felt tears burning behind her eyes but refused to let them fall. "So you saved me to prove a point." "I saved you because allowing you to die would have meant accepting that my organization had degraded into something uncontrolled, something arbitrary." Raoul's dark eyes met hers with brutal honesty. "Your death would have been proof that I'd failed to maintain order. The truth of it landed like a physical blow. Not kindness, not compassion, not mercy. Control. So I'm alive because my death would have been inconvenient for you, Betty said, voice hollow. You're alive because unnecessary deaths weaken power, Raoul corrected. Fear must be precise, Betty. Random violence makes people desperate. Desperate people become unpredictable. Unpredictable people destroy everything. He leaned back in the chair, studying her reaction. You wanted honesty. There it is. I didn't save you because you're special or innocent or deserving. I saved you because chaos is unacceptable, and your death would have represented chaos I couldn't control. Betty absorbed this, the cold logic of it somehow more terrifying than violence. At least violence was emotional. This was something far more dangerous, a man who'd calculated the value of human life and found it wanting unless it served a larger purpose. Does that disappoint you? Raoul asked. Betty considered lying, then decided truth was the only currency with value in this room. No. It terrifies me. Good. It should. Raoul stood, moving to the window. Fear keeps people honest. It reminds them that actions have consequences, and consequences are rarely negotiable. Is that how you live? Betty asked. Everything calculated? Everyone expendable unless they serve your purpose? Yes. The single word carried no apology, no justification, no regret. Betty felt something shift inside her, not acceptance exactly, but understanding. Raoul Blanco wasn't a monster. He was something more complicated and more dangerous. A man who'd embraced brutality as methodology, who'd stripped morality down to its functional components and discarded everything that didn't serve efficiency. What happens now? She asked for the 100th time. But this time the question carried different weight. Raoul turned from the window. Now I give you a choice. Betty's pulse quickened. What kind of choice? The kind that determines whether you walk out of this building or stay in my world forever. He moved closer, his presence commanding without being overtly threatening. Kozlov, the Albanian, Moretti's nephew. They all received very clear messages last night. They understand that operating in my territory without permission carries costs they can't afford. Antonio Ruiz is alive but destroyed, a warning to everyone in my organization about the price of unauthorized ambition. He paused, letting the implications settle. The threat to you is over. No one will come looking. No one will ask questions. The story is finished. Betty's hands trembled in her lap. Then why do I feel like you're about to tell me it's just beginning? Because you're smarter than you pretend to be. Raoul's expression softened fractionally. You've seen too much, Betty. You know names, faces, methods. You understand how my organization operates, who my enemies are, where the fractures exist. That knowledge makes you dangerous. I would never... I know. Raoul cut her off gently. I believe you. But belief isn't insurance, and in my world, loose ends have a way of becoming fatal liabilities. Betty's voice barely rose above a whisper. So you're going to kill me after all? No. Raoul crouched in front of her, eye level now, close enough that she could see the faint scar along his jawline, the exhaustion etched around his eyes. I'm going to give you a choice that very few people receive. Walk away, or stay. I don't understand. Walk away means new identity, new city, new life. You disappear completely. Betty Parker dies in paperwork, and someone else takes her first breath somewhere far from here. I provide everything, documents, money, security, protection. You start over, clean, with the understanding that you never speak about what happened here, ever. And if I stay? Raoul's expression became unreadable. Then you accept that your old life is over. You work for me. You become part of the structure, protected, but never free. The choice was impossible and completely clear. Freedom with silence, or safety with servitude. How long do I have to decide? Betty asked. Until morning. He stood, moving toward the door. Raoul. His name felt strange in her mouth. He paused, looking back. Thank you, Betty said quietly. For saving me, even if it was just to prove a point. Something flickered across his face, too quick to identify, too complex to name. Get some rest, Betty Parker. Tomorrow you choose who you become. The door closed softly behind him, leaving her alone with an impossible decision and the weight of survival she hadn't asked for but couldn't refuse. Betty stood at the window of her room, watching dawn break over the city she'd lived in for 6 years but never really understood. From this height, it looked almost peaceful. Snow-covered streets gleaming in early light, buildings casting long shadows, ordinary people beginning ordinary days. They had no idea what happened in the spaces between their comfortable lives. The violence, the calculations, the bodies that disappeared without questions. She'd been one of them once. Invisible, insignificant, safe, in obscurity. That version of herself was gone. Behind her, Elena packed a small bag with mechanical efficiency, new clothes, identification documents, cash in neat stacks, a phone with a single programmed number, everything Betty would need to disappear. She'd made her choice in the hours before dawn, lying awake and tracing the path her life had taken from ordinary to impossible. The decision hadn't been difficult once she'd stopped fighting what she already knew. She couldn't stay. Not because she didn't understand Raoul's world, she understood it too well. The structure, the hierarchy, the brutal efficiency of violence as communication. She could learn to navigate it, maybe even thrive in it. But she'd never stop being afraid. Never stop calculating whether today was the day she became expendable. Never stop hearing the screams from the basement or seeing Antonio's broken hands or feeling rope cutting into her wrists. Freedom wearing chains was still captivity. The door opened. Raoul entered, dressed for business in a dark suit that transformed him from predator to executive. Only his eyes remained the same, watchful, calculating, missing nothing. "You decided," he said, reading her expression immediately. "I'm leaving." Betty's voice was steadier than she expected. "New city, new name, new life." Raoul nodded, no surprise registering. "Where? You're asking me to choose?" "The city determines the support structure. West Coast, Midwest, South, each requires different arrangements." His tone was purely practical. "Where would you go if geography wasn't a limitation?" Betty thought of mountains and ocean, of places she'd seen in pictures but never visited. Somewhere warm, where it doesn't snow. Phoenix, Raoul decided. Large enough to disappear into, transient enough that newcomers don't raise questions, far enough from here that your past stays buried. He pulled an envelope from his jacket, setting it on the table. New identity. Birth certificate, social security card, driver's license, complete background that stands up to standard verification. Your name is Grace Mitchell, 26 years old, relocated for work, bank account with $50,000, replenished quarterly for 2 years. Betty stared at the envelope, understanding the weight of what it represented. Why quarterly? Why 2 years? Because starting over is expensive, and I don't create problems by cutting people off before they're established. Raoul moved to the window, looking out at the city. After 2 years, you're on your own. The money stops, the protection remains, but at a distance. And if I need help before then? The phone has one number programmed, emergencies only. You use it, people come. But understand, calling that number means accepting that you're still connected to me, still part of this world. Use it wisely. Betty picked up the envelope, feeling the thickness of her new identity between her fingers. Grace Mitchell. The name felt foreign and somehow fitting grace she hadn't earned, a gift wrapped in threat. What happens to Betty Parker? She asked quietly. Officially, nothing. She simply stops existing. No death certificate, no missing person report. People will assume she ran off, got into trouble, disappeared the way vulnerable people do in cities that don't care enough to look. Raoul's reflection in the window was impassive. Your roommate already thinks you quit without notice. Your boss at Rosie's hired a replacement. In 6 months, no one will remember you were ever here. The casual erasure of her existence should have hurt more. Instead, Betty felt something close to relief. Being forgotten was safer than being remembered. Can I ask you something? She turned to face him directly. Yes. Antonio, what happened to him? Really? Raoul considered how much truth to offer. He's alive, broken, but functional. I sent him to work in a meat processing plant in Montana, legitimate business. No criminal connection, minimum wage, no chance of advancement. He'll spend the rest of his life doing manual labor and remembering what ambition cost him. That's worse than death. That's the point. Raoul's expression remained neutral. Antonio gets to live with his failure every day. Everyone in my organization gets to see him and understand what happens when you operate without permission. It's a lesson that keeps working long after a corpse stops being useful. Betty absorbed this, the cold efficiency of it somehow more brutal than the violence she'd witnessed. Will I ever see you again? The question emerged before she could stop it. Raoul's dark eyes met hers with something almost like regret. Almost. No. After today, I don't exist for you, and you don't exist for me. That's how you stay safe, Grace Mitchell. The use of her new name felt like a door closing. Elena appeared in the doorway. Car's ready. Betty picked up the packed bag, slinging it over her shoulder. Everything she needed to start over, fit in, carry on luggage, which said something profound about how little she'd accumulated in 24 years of existence. She moved toward the door, then paused beside Raoul. "I won't forget," she said quietly. "What you did, what you are, all of it. Good." His voice carried finality. "Fear is survival. Never forget that staying alive sometimes means accepting help from people who terrify you." Betty nodded, understanding that this was his version of goodbye. No sentiment, no false comfort, just brutal honesty wrapped in warning. She followed Elena through corridors she'd memorized, past doors she'd never see opened, down stairs that led to freedom she'd never truly feel. The car was black, expensive, windows tinted dark. The driver didn't speak as Betty slid into the back seat. Elena handed her a second envelope thicker than the first. Instructions, contacts, emergency protocols. Read everything, then burn it. Elena's expression remained impassive. "Good luck, Grace Mitchell." The door closed. The car pulled away from the safe house, tires crunching through fresh snow, carrying Betty Parker toward the airport and the fiction of Grace Mitchell waiting on the other side of the country. She looked back once through the rear window. Raoul stood at a third-floor window, a dark silhouette against bright interior light, watching her leave, making sure she actually went. Then the car turned a corner, and he disappeared from view. Raoul remained at the window long after the car vanished into morning traffic. Behind him, Leon entered quietly. "The rival crews have all acknowledged your message." Kozlov sent formal apology. The Albanian requested a meeting to clarify boundaries. Moretti's nephew has gone silent, probably left the city. "Good." Raoul turned from the window, his expression settling back into the mask of control he wore like armor. "Schedule the meeting with the Albanian. Make it clear that boundaries aren't negotiable, they're absolute. And the woman? If anyone asks?" "No one will ask. And if they do, Betty Parker left the city weeks ago." "Destination unknown. Case closed." Leon nodded, understanding that some stories ended without resolution because resolution raised uncomfortable questions. After he left, Raoul sat at his desk, pulling up security footage from the safe house the moment he'd found Betty in the snow, carried her to safety, made the choice that would cost him blood and money and trust. He watched himself crouch beside her broken form, removing his coat, making a decision that defied every principle of self-preservation he'd built his empire upon. And he understood, with cold clarity, that he'd never truly know why. Maybe it was control. Maybe it was chaos wearing the mask of mercy. Maybe it was the last fragment of humanity he'd managed to preserve while building an empire on calculated violence. It didn't matter. Betty Parker was gone. Grace Mitchell was someone else's problem. And Raoul Blanco remained exactly what he'd always been, a man who saved one life to prove that his empire hadn't degraded into meaningless cruelty. He closed the laptop and stood, straightening his suit, preparing for another day of maintaining the structure that kept his world from collapsing into chaos. Outside, snow continued falling, covering streets and erasing footprints, burying secrets the city would never bother to uncover. The Mafia boss who'd found a bound waitress in the snow had shocked everyone not by becoming good, but by proving that even in darkness, control mattered more than chaos. And that, in the end, was the only redemption men like him could ever claim. Thanks for staying with this story right till the final moment. You're the reason these stories come alive. If you're ready for another powerful journey, just tap the next video on your screen. And before you go, leave a quick comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I'm excited to see your thoughts and connect with you down there.